The Belfast Historical Society invites you to take a look through a window on history. Join us in considering the people, places, and events that for over 200 years have been woven into the fabric of the city we know as Belfast, Maine.
Welcome to Becoming Maine, a bicentennial presentation with Liam Riordan, Professor of History, University of Maine. This program is co-sponsored by the Belfast Free Library and the Belfast Historical Society Museum. Professor Riordan will give an illustrated presentation exploring the long statehood process in Maine that culminated in 1820 with separation from Massachusetts. That struggle engaged a range of challenging public issues that are still recognizable today. Professor Riordan received his bachelor's degree in history at the University of California, Berkeley, and his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. He has been a faculty member in the Department of History at the University of Maine since 1997. He is a specialist on the American Revolution, especially the religious, racial, and ethnic diversity in the Philadelphia region from 1770 to 1830. Liam has done considerable public history work to commemorate the bicentennial of the state of Maine in 2019-2020. We hope you enjoy this program. Liam.
Well, it is a real pleasure to be here, one of my first speaking engagements since we've all gone into this new experience of sheltering in place and learning how to deal with COVID-19 in our lives. So I really appreciate the invitation from Brenda Harrington here at the Belfast Free Library, and also to Megan Panett, who has just given me this very nice introduction, and thanks to the audience that is almost entirely virtual. So thank you for live streaming or listening to the recorded version of this later. Over the last several years, I have immersed myself in the history of Maine's statehood era that stretches from the 1780s to the 1820s. And since today's event comes on the immediate heels of July 4th, it seems especially appropriate to begin somewhat broadly to consider the place of early American history. How do we remember that distant past, and how might it inform our understanding of contemporary society? So this is what I mean when I ask in my title, what do we want history to do to us? And this leads to a number of related questions. Do we have a goal in mind when we practice historical commemoration? How do we and how should we remember the relatively distant past? History can entertain, inform, instruct, and at its very best, historical understanding helps us grasp deeper meanings and senses of self by expanding our gaze from the individual, the personal, the present moment, to something broader that we share. So at the heart of doing history, what makes it fascinating and exciting to me is thinking about that relationship between the past and the present. How are they simultaneously informing one another? What changes over time, but also what endures? And this brings me to perhaps the most frequently quoted aphorism about history by George Santayana, the famous Spanish-American philosopher, who famously stated, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And I guess at the heart, I disagree with the implication of what Santayana says here, because history never repeats itself literally, right? It is too complicated. Many, many things are changing. And so again, it's this balance. What is changing? What is enduring? How do we understand that relationship? And this is what the bicentennial moment encourages us to do, to think carefully and more publicly about events related to statehood 200 years ago, that in another year or two, we will not have an excuse to dwell on and think about. So, why should we think about the statehood era? What do we want history to do to us? And so I pair this opening question with one of the most public symbols of the bicentennial in the state of Maine, and that is the commemorative license plate that many people in Maine have on the front bumper of their car. It's a vanity plate, a time-limited one. I think when 2020 is over, you'll have to take off your bicentennial plate and put up a boring old front plate. So this is one of the ways that we commemorate the past. But what it does for us in terms of our thinking and self-understanding isn't quite so clear, right? Just that image itself is perhaps more about celebration than reflection or commemoration. So let's turn to the most basic facts about Maine's statehood. Maine became the 23rd state in the United States on March 15th, 1820. And this ended a relationship that had begun in the 1650s with Maine as a part of Massachusetts, often referred to as the District of Maine within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And this is the first of two terrific period maps that we'll be looking at today by Moses Greenleaf. This one was created in 1820, and I sort of think of it as the first official map of Maine as a state, no longer part of Massachusetts. And you can see in Greenleaf's rendering here, he more or less depicts Maine the way we think of the boundaries of the state today. And I'll come back to this in a bit, because in part, that is a little bit misleading, right? One of the things that has changed is the actual boundaries of the state of Maine. So my broad concern today is to think a bit about, or to ask the question, can the past and the present speak to one another? How do we balance change and persistence and understand that today is very different from the past, yet at the same time, we can see profound connections that link us to the past? And really, the talk is structured around 4 present-day connections to the statehood era from the 1780s to the 1820s. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into 4 themes that were very important in the statehood era that I think all of us will recognize as also aspects of life in contemporary Maine. So let me begin with the most famous dimension of Maine's statehood, and also one that perhaps is the most confusing. Slavery and Maine's statehood are fundamentally connected. But this is a bit of a puzzle, right? There were not, in the statehood era, just as there are not today, a huge number of people of African descent in the state of Maine. And Massachusetts had abolished slavery, so there are no slaves in Maine during the statehood era, and just a few people, free people of color. So how did Maine get embroiled in what was the first national crisis over slavery in the United States? Well, when Maine applied to the U.S. Congress to become a state, that petition arrived at a point where the U.S. Congress was deadlocked over the question of admitting Missouri as a slave state. And right away, it was clear that Maine statehood was going to be problematic as long as the issue of Missouri statehood had not been resolved. And so one of the congressmen from what was still the District of Maine wrote back to William King, the most famous politician and in favor of statehood and who will become the first governor of the independent state of Maine. This congressman wrote back to King from D.C. and warned that some bargain or compromise will be needed. And he advised that all Maine members of Congress act prudently and, quote, say nothing opposed to the wishes of the Southern people. And then he adds in a PS to this letter, I hope the people of Maine will remain still on the slave question. Now, this put William King in a really interesting position because William King's stepbrother, Rufus King, was a leading anti-slavery politician in the U.S. Senate. So we would hope today that William would follow the lead of his brother and write back to this congressman giving him advice from D.C. and say, no, we are going to speak up on the slavery issue. We do not want to become a state if it is linked to slavery in any way. And there is just no question of the searing nature of this issue in national political culture in this period. So a Portland newspaper reported in January 1820, in just the period that the petition has arrived, that, quote, the debate on the Missouri question has at length commenced in the Senate, and it absorbs so much attention that until it is indefinitely settled, it may almost be said that no other business will be done in Congress. Never were the galleries and lobbies more crowded. So in our contemporary moment of Black Lives Matter and concerns about police use of violence against people of African descent, we have a profound link to this issue that was all over the press and public attention in the sort of the crux of the statehood issue. Now, what ends up happening is that the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, who was from Kentucky and had a lot of sympathy with Missouri, wanted Missouri to come in, and of course, Kentucky was a slave state, Clay put together a sort of complicated package of bills that would bring Missouri and Maine in together. And this went to the U.S. House of Representatives, and this on the essential question of would Maine be admitted as linked to Missouri's admission, that passed the U.S. House of Representatives by only 3 votes, 90 to 87. Now, what is particularly interesting about that vote from a Maine point of view is that the majority of the U.S. congressmen from Maine voted against Maine statehood. 5 of the 7 said, no, we do not want to be admitted to the Union if it is involved in an acceptance of slavery in Missouri. And then, as now, when politicians are forced to make a tough decision on a really controversial issue that's coming down to the very wire, they explain why they took their position to the public. So we've got great newspaper letters from both sides explaining, here is why I took the stand that I did. So 4 of the 5 Maine congressmen who voted against the linkage of Maine and Missouri wrote a joint letter that explained their fear of slave power as corrupting to Republican government and they stated that it was, quote, abhorrent to their notions of the rights of man and humanity. And particularly interesting to me, and really something I learned in doing my research, was that they insisted that it was a falsehood to call this a compromise. They said, we utterly protest against and refuse to sanction this with our approval. So the sort of textbook definition of this crisis is the Maine-Missouri Compromise, but having read this newspaper letter, I now call it the Maine-Missouri Crisis, right? They insisted that we not think of it as a compromise, something forced upon them by the narrowest of margins. And in fact, if the two pro-compromise congressmen from Maine had voted with the 5 in the majority, it would not have carried in the US Congress. That is how close that vote was. Now, I'm happy to come back and talk about the Maine-Missouri Crisis later, but the final comment I want to make about this for now is that it really highlights for us the importance of Blackness in American political life, even in a state like Maine that does not have a large population of people of African descent. Right? This is a legacy of the incredible importance of slavery at the very center of American history. So let's move on to a second past-present connection where an important issue in the statehood era of the late 18th and early 19th century is also recognizably an issue in contemporary Maine life. And this is to ask the question, what did Maine's statehood mean for Wabanaki sovereignty? When we are discussing state formation in North America, surely one of the crucial contexts concerns the Native American presence and the persistence of Native societies and governments in the face of colonization. So this map from the Portland Press Herald in December 2014 shows us how the colonial presence across northeastern North America, from New England and into Quebec and the Canadian Maritimes, are all entangled with Native American land claims and their active presence throughout Wabanaki from the pre-colonial era up to the very present. Now, what does this mean in a historical sense? And how do Native American issues get tied to Maine statehood? And here, I want to emphasize two somewhat different dimensions of this issue, that there are both perils for Wabanaki people that are connected to statehood, but there also is an important degree of Wabanaki persistence through the statehood era. So let me start with the perils. And I think it is quite clear that statehood was a time of rapid Wabanaki dispossession and an intensification of colonization. When we look at the census data starting in 1790, that first half of the 19th century is a period of incredible expansion of the white population in Maine. And that is directly challenging and threatening and dispossessing Wabanaki people in their traditional homelands. And one of the most striking ways to think about this is to reflect a bit on voting rights for people of Wabanaki descent in Maine. So federal voting rights for Native Americans are created in 1924, right? Which itself is pretty shocking. But that federal legislation was not controlling in state elections, right? That is part of the federal system. The national government and state governments are often quite distinct. And so the right for Wabanaki people to vote in the state of Maine was not legal until a constitutional amendment in 1954. So Maine is the second to last state in the US to recognize Native Americans' rights to vote in state elections. And I think quite importantly, that decision that was sent to popular referendum and passed in Maine by an overwhelming majority in 1954, but a great deal of that strong consensus in the white voting public really hinged on confidence that the Native American population in Maine was assimilating and would soon disappear. So for a lot of Wabanaki people, the right to vote in state elections is a kind of mixed opportunity, right? It is a kind of, if they're acknowledging the sovereignty of the state, what does that mean in terms of Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Micmac, Maliseet sovereignty? So this question of voting is a fascinating one. Now, at the same time that statehood has some profound and disturbing negative consequences for Wabanaki people, it also is really important to recognize some of the very distinctive features of Wabanaki history. And this starts with the fact that for the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy in particular, they have maintained a officially recognized legitimacy in their traditional homelands in a continuous and unbroken fashion. And I think this is exceptional in the history of Native American groups in the United States east of the Mississippi River, right? This is remarkable. Now, there's no question that officially recognized homeland is shrinking and getting smaller and smaller, but they have maintained that hold in a really important and powerful manner. And another aspect of Wabanaki persistence in Maine that is quite striking is that there were Penobscot tribal delegates to the Maine legislature in 1823. They were recognized as official delegates to the legislature. They had seats there. They were non-voting members, so I'm not saying this was like perfect equality or anything like that. But again, we're seeing this powerful statement of presence and a sort of active participation or oversight or presence in the state legislature, right? This is only the second or third meeting of the legislature of Maine in 1823. And the Passamaquoddies would join them there in 1842, and the Holton Band of Maliseets in 2010. Maine is the only state in the U.S. to have tribal representatives in its state legislature almost from its inception. So this is a very important part of the unique and evolving Wabanaki-Maine relationship that continues to the present, right? And Wabanaki issues, for those of us living in Maine today, we recognize as of growing importance and of growing concern, right? Where we are today as sort of mainstream white American society is very different from where those voters were in 1950s, for the majority of whom assumed Wabanaki people would soon not be part of the state of Maine. So let's move to a third past-present connection. And this is to return to these questions of the boundaries of the state of Maine. And that earlier map that I showed, of sort of the classic representation of the state of Maine from 1820, in a lot of ways was quite misleading. The international border to the north remains unsettled until 1842. So well beyond the end of this question of separation from Massachusetts, there is still no clear official definition of what is the limit of Maine and the United States to the north and to the east. And I think a striking way to, well, so let me just say, this image we're looking at is the fourth edition of the sort of most detailed British map of North America in the 18th century. And these widely varying colored lines we see on the map represent the very different sense that the treaty negotiators at the end of the American Revolution had about what should be the boundary between British North America and now the independent United States. So quite a range of debate. And so they put words into the treaty that describe where the boundary was, but those words had no actual meaning that was understood and agreed upon on the ground. Right? So that's in the 1780s. If we move ahead to the 1820 census, right? So this is right on the verge of Maine statehood, right? Maine becomes a state March 15th, 1820. So in a lot of ways, that 1820 census is our first clear demographic assessment of what are the contours of the state of Maine. And I looked up the statistics for Penobscot County, and the third largest town listed in Penobscot County in 1820 is Madawaska. Now, Madawaska is hours north of Bangor and is not in Penobscot County today, but in the 1820 census, it's listed there, and there's a little asterisk. And then if you look at the bottom of the page, there is this sort of remarkable commentary. It explains that Madawaska is the French settlement near Canada, about 200 miles from any town in Maine. And the census taker also said the only way to get to Madawaska is via New Brunswick. You have to go to St. John and then go up the St. John River in order to get there. And the census taker continued, and I'm going to quote him here, "The French have supposed they were in Canada. It is probable the county line, when run, will divide the large rural community between Penobscot and Washington counties in Maine." Now, this position of Madawaska is a really crucial one, I think, for understanding Maine in the statehood era, but also Maine today. That the issues that are most pressing in Madawaska are often very different than those in Augusta or in Portland, right? And that firming up of the international border that occurs in 1842 is really a moment of tragedy for a lot of French speakers in the St. John Valley. This is dividing and sundering their communities and families that are on both sides of the river and have thought of the river as a connecting force, not a dividing force. And this goes through waves in American history, most intensely recently in the wake of 9/11, with the hardening of the international border, returning to a stronger sense of separation and isolation, That's true in the context of COVID as well, right? The international border is closed. And so this uncertainty about the international border is an important issue in itself. But I think it also reminds us of the extraordinary regional diversity of the state of Maine. And that's really a key issue in the fourth and final of the past-present connections that I want to talk about. So the statehood era is marked by incredible partisan anger, really sharp disagreements between the sort of dominant political factions, the Federalists on the one side and Democratic Republicans on the other. And this partisan anger and the broader state separation movement is often described in sort of simplistic terms as cleaving along a sort of two Maines. That there's a coastal Maine that is more in favor of staying part of Massachusetts, and that there's an interior part of Maine that is more in favor of separating. And this is not just a geographic and political division, it's also related to wealth, the coast more affluent than interior areas. It's related to occupation, with maritime commerce particularly committed to staying connected to Massachusetts for a variety of reasons. And this even has a religious dimension, as Congregationalists are more comfortable staying part of Massachusetts because the Congregational Church had special status under the state constitution of Massachusetts. People were required to pay taxes to support a congregational minister, even if they were not a Congregationalist themselves. And that stays on the books in Massachusetts until the early 1830s. So Baptists and Methodists, who are newcomers to Maine, who are primarily settling in interior areas, who are primarily poorer, who are primarily Democratic Republicans, they have a real religious reason for objecting to the rules of the Massachusetts government. Now, this question of, how stark is that division is, I think, a really interesting one that is really a good one to think about from the context of local history. So I want to start by sort of explaining this complicated map and then turn to some discussion of the voting data we have from Belfast. So what we have here are a visual representation of the 6 separation votes held in the District of Maine from 1792 to 1819. All right, this is part of why I say the statehood era stretches from the 1780s to the 1920s, right? This is not a one-and-done sort of deal. And this is puzzling to people who live in Maine today, right? Because most Mainers are familiar with a sense of hostility toward people from away in general, and perhaps people from Massachusetts in particular. So why, if given the opportunity to separate from Massachusetts, we would presume that this would not be a difficult decision. But obviously it was, right? And this is one of the ways that our present-day perspective can really distort and get in the way of our understanding what a difficult decision this was at the time. So the green areas on this map show county-level voting data of places that opposed separating from Massachusetts, and the purple areas are counties that supported separation. And there are really just two, well, maybe three broad points I want to make about this general voting data, and I'm happy to talk about it more if anyone is curious. And the first thing I'll say is if we look at the final vote in July of 1819, every single county has a majority in favor of separation. Right? The lowest support is in Hancock County, right? And this is where Belfast was up till Waldo County was created in 1827. But even in Hancock County, 52% of the people are in favor of separation. So in some ways, 1819 is a boring vote to talk about, right? Everybody agrees. What's more interesting to me is the 1807 map. That's almost the exact opposite of the 1819 map. In 1807, there was only one county where voters had a majority in favor of separating from Massachusetts. Only Kennebec County was prepared to take that stand. So one thing that tells us is that this was also not a logical, linear progression where every vote gets a little bit more purple, and then we're done, right? This has jagged ups and downs and really changes in the meaning of what did people think separation would mean. And part of why 1807 is such a low moment for the separation movement is that it is changing its partisan affiliation. So the separation movement begins in the 1780s, really led by wealthy Federalist gentlemen in Falmouth and modern-day Portland. And they would like Maine to become independent so that they can take their rightful place as leaders of the state. Right? And they're never going to be able to do that if they've got to compete against wealthier and longer-standing families in Boston. Now, that Federalist commitment in Maine to separation begins to fade in the first decade of the 19th century. And so I think 1807 reflects some confusion about how does the statehood question connect to partisan politics. And it's emerging as a leading Democratic-Republican issue. And also in that first decade of the 19th century, it's pretty decisive that there are a majority of residents of the District of Maine are Democratic Republicans. When that's clear, Federalists in Maine no longer want to separate, right? Because they're going to get totally overwhelmed by a Democratic Republican majority. The last thing that confuses that 1807 vote is on the same day they voted on the separation question, there was also a governor's race. And the person that is elected to be governor of Massachusetts in 1807 was James Sullivan, who was born in York County, who had been an attorney in Georgetown and Biddeford, Maine. And so all of a sudden there was a chance for sort of a native son to be governor. So if you're voting for Sullivan, who wins, and he's a rare Democratic Republican to capture the governorship in this period, and he does so based on overwhelming support, in large part, from the District of Maine, right? So this 1807 is just a mess. The last thing I'll say about this map is that it also helps us to recognize the really crucial place of the War of 1812. And we can see, and this is kind of confusing, that there are two state separation votes in 1816. So basically, in the War of 1812, the British occupy Eastport, islands in the Passamaquoddy, and of course Castine, just across Penobscot Bay from where we are in Belfast today. And that is not responded to forcibly by the Massachusetts state government. And in fact, Massachusetts state government has opposed the federal war effort in a way that's kind of unthinkable today. They have refused to allow the militia in the state of Massachusetts to be nationalized and to be part of the federal war effort. So for people in the District of Maine, they felt like they were not being defended by these distant politicians in Boston. And so the separation movement, after slumping in this incredible low in 1807, when you think it was totally moribund, it gets a big shot in the arm with the War of 1812, and we get these two post-war votes in 1816. Now, what happens is that 62% of statewide voters favor separation in that May of 1816 vote. You can see, pretty green map. But that strong majority came with an unusually low turnout. So the Legislature of Massachusetts said, we are okay with the district becoming separate, and we are going to have another election where people can vote for representatives for a state constitutional convention to begin the process of separation. But at the same time, we would like you to confirm that you do in fact want to separate. So what happens is that both sides mobilize really strongly, and there is a much bigger turnout in the second election of 1816, but the percentage in favor of separation drops by about 10 percentage points. And the state legislature had set a limit of 56% needed for separation, right? Now the May vote was 62%, so that didn't seem like a very hard bar, but when the votes came out, 54% supported separation, and this was below the needed 56%. Now, I know this is going on too long, but I love this detail, so I'm going to throw it in. So here you've got this weird thing. They haven't met the right number, but they've elected town representatives to go be part of a state constitutional convention. So these people meet in Brunswick, and I'm sorry to say that there was a college professor there, a guy who had taught mathematics at Harvard, and he came up with this crazy explanation about how the 54% actually did meet the minimum requirement set by the state of Massachusetts. And I cannot really explain this. It was the number of towns and take away the difference in the votes between the towns, and he just cooked this thing up. Now, this became a national laughingstock. And newspapers across the US circulated this story about these hicks and buffoons in rural Maine who were so foolish, blah, 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 blah. I mean, this fit a lot of the anti-separation stereotypes that said, look, you're not going to have the people of proper dignity to be state officials, and this seemed to fall right into their hands. So it seems like after that debacle that the separation movement is really dead in the water. And then we get that unanimous vote, not unanimous, but I think 72% of statewide voters favor independence in 1819. And the final thing I will say about this slide is the real reason for that transition was a change in the federal coasting law. And one of the major arguments against separation was that there had been protection against being charged tariffs by adjoining states. And Massachusetts has some very funny boundaries, and that meant that you could sail from Eastport all the way to New Jersey and be in a protected tariff-free zone. If Massachusetts became, if Maine became independent and that coasting law was still in effect, why, as soon as you got past New Hampshire, you might be liable for tariffs. So the pro-statehood forces saw what a big problem this was. They changed the law in the US Congress, where there are strong Democratic Republican majorities, and they want Maine to become independent because that will help them, right? Just like in the DC statehood question today, they see this as an easy pickup to raise the Democratic Republican presence in the federal government. So they changed the coasting law, and the outcome is that kind of extraordinary 1819 vote with such strong support for separation. Now, much as I love this countywide voting data and looking at this image that looks like the state of Maine, it is also quite misleading to think about the election in the way that it's depicted in this map. So I want to dig a bit deeper into local circumstances and turn to what is really my favorite map from the statehood era, also created by Moses Greenleaf in 1829. And what Greenleaf shows us in this map is where the people who voted actually lived. Right? We had those county lines before running to infinity somewhere in the uncertain northern border. But in fact, the English-speaking male voting population are clustered on the coast and in the southwestern corner of the state. And what Greenleaf further did with the color scheme here is that the blue areas represent parts of Maine settled by English speakers at the time of the Revolution. The red areas are expanded migration by the time of Jefferson's election in 1800, and the yellow represents places that had been settled by English speakers by the time of statehood. And Greenleaf, though born in that other part of Massachusetts, had migrated to Maine, had lived in the Bangor area for a while, and when he made this map, he lived in the town of Williamsburg, which is basically at the top yellow bump of this map, right under the compass rose. So he was very conscious of where you lived really shaped what your experience was. Now, one of the things that's so interesting about this is that little town of Williamsburg, right near modern-day Milo, Maine, in that 1819 vote, when basically, there's huge support and separation, if the two Maines thesis should suggest that an interior place like Williamsburg would be a classic place in favor of separation from Massachusetts, but in that town, the vote in 1819 was 13 voters against separation and only 2 in favor. So when we look at local data, or at the more regional level, not just at the statewide level, we begin to find some different sorts of patterns and discover that the two Maines thesis can be kind of simplistic. It wipes out, it hides a lot of variation. And this is certainly true of the Belfast case as well. So we're going to zero in on the part of this map where Belfast is located. So we've got kind of Penobscot Bay right in the middle. And I'll just point with my finger since maybe you can't see it on screen. Here's Belfast. So partly settled by the time of the Revolution and then some expansion into the interior. So Penobscot Bay, we've got the adjoining towns of Northport, Lincolnville, up to Prospect and Frankfort. And then on the other side of Penobscot Bay, all of this Hancock County, Bucksport, Orland, Castine, Sedgwick. Now, according to the two Maines thesis, coastal towns are supposed to be opposed to separation, right? These are places that are more settled by older arrivals, they're more strongly congregationalist, they're more tied to the maritime trades. So according to the two Maines thesis, Belfast should be strongly opposed to separation. But when we look at the Belfast votes in those 6 elections from 1792 to 1819, we see exactly the opposite. And in fact, Belfast is one of the very few towns in the whole District of Maine that consistently and overwhelmingly votes in favor of separation. That is a real surprise. And when I look closer at the adjoining towns and how are they voting and what about the towns on the east side of the bay, there's a really clear cleavage that Belfast and its adjoining communities are strongly and consistently in favor of separation. And if you go just a little bit further down east across Penobscot Bay, those communities are among the most opposed to staying part of Massachusetts. So a really interesting cleavage right along the lines of where Belfast stands. Now, I would say that one reason for this is that Belfast residents had a long-standing disappointment with the support they got from the distant Massachusetts government centered in Boston. And both in the American Revolution and in the War of 1812, Belfast would suffer attack and occupation by British troops, neither of which were repelled successfully by any kind of state mobilization in Massachusetts. So that would be one of undoubtedly many other factors that would help to explain this. And, this is really the stuff for local historians, genealogists to really dig into. Who were the leading public voices of Belfast in this era, and why were they so consistently and so strongly opposed to being part of Massachusetts, right? Belfast is a real clear champion of Maine as an independent state. All right, so I have been talking for a very long time. I'm going to catch my breath, and I would love to take questions from the handful of people who are here, or perhaps in the mysterious virtual world, we have other people who are watching and sending in questions via chat. So thanks very much for coming, and I welcome any questions. We can flip back to older slides or revisit any of those issues. Yeah?
Did any of the Native American groups, tribes, take a stand on statehood? And if so, were they in favor of separation or what?
Great. So I'll just repeat the question in case the mic didn't pick it up. Is there a clear Wabanaki position on the statehood issue? And so there are a couple ways to think about this. I mean, in general, the white formal political system was not particularly interested in Native Americans as being involved in this process. And it is clear that Wabanaki groups looked at Maine statehood with a great deal of trepidation. And this really hinges on the fact that Wabanaki diplomats had entered into treaty negotiations with Massachusetts dating back decades and centuries by the time of the statehood era. So Wabanaki people think, well, what's going to happen with these treaties with Massachusetts? And this becomes a real complicating factor in the statehood process. And it really is one of my theories. I have not seen evidence of this, but I think it's plausible that one of the reasons that there is that Penobscot tribal delegate at the state legislature in 1823 is because in order to make sure statehood goes through, Massachusetts gives Maine a bunch of money, and Maine promises to honor the treaty obligations that had been entered into by Massachusetts. So there's this real clear financial issue that Wabanaki people clearly had a interest in and a relationship to, and I think that is kind of tied in with that unique legislative development. So, I think it's very fair to say that broadly speaking, statehood was likely to bring more population growth and an expansion into this region, and Wabanaki people were rightly very concerned about that as a threat to their sovereignty and even to their lives. Yes, question in the back.
What was the population of Wabanaki around 1820 compared to the state at large?
So the Wabanaki population is quite small, and there's basically been a century of warfare from what's often called King Philip's War at the end of the 17th century through the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War in the 1760s. So when we're thinking about the Wabanaki population in this statehood era from the 1780s to the 1820s, this clearly represents a very significant low point in their population. So I couldn't really give a specific number, but hundreds, thousands. And what's really crucial about this, I think, is to really reflect on Native American demography over the course of the long term. So if we look just in the early 19th century, there is really a catastrophic and horrific loss of life, right? And that really, in some ways, stretches all the way back to 1492, right? We are all very conscious today about the incredible impact of epidemic disease. Well, this was the most fundamental fact of colonization, that the diseases that came with colonial settlers devastated Native American communities. Now, so that would be the perils that I talked about before. But when we look at the long run of Native American demography in the United States and in Maine, what we discover is that starting around 1890, the population of Native American people in the United States is going up. And that's why I say to my students and my children, Wabanaki issues are going to be more important in the public life of Maine 10 years from now and 20 years from now than they were 10 or 20 years before us. So a lot of times Native American history gets pigeonholed into a colonial era, into the 17th century, into the 18th century. And I would say, from a Wabanaki perspective, it is still a colonial era, but the Native American population is ascendant in spite of that ongoing threat to their sovereignty and livelihood. So no question, though, the statehood era is really a time of danger and catastrophe and loss for Wabanaki people in Maine.
No, I can't believe they didn't get the state vote until 1954.
Yeah, it's amazing.
That was astounding.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Unusual question, but I've never heard this. Did Massachusetts really care if we broke away and became a state, or how did they feel about that?
So it's a great question, a really interesting one, because I am sort of interested in the nitty-gritty of politics in this era. So what ends up happening is the partisan position of Federalists and Democratic Republicans in old Massachusetts versus the District of Maine is working at cross purposes. Federalists in old Massachusetts, by the second decade of the 19th century, would like to get rid of the District of Maine, and Democratic Republicans in old Massachusetts would like to keep it. So the partisan, it's not a consistent partisan position. These parties are badly split based on their self-interest of where they're looking. So in large part, the majority in Massachusetts would like to get rid of the District of Maine so that they can have secure Federalist majorities in Massachusetts, which they will have if they can get rid of the Democratic Republican majorities in the District of Maine. All right, well, thank you all. I've had a great time. I really appreciate you coming, and thanks to the online audience.
To learn more about Belfast's distinguished heritage, visit the Belfast Museum at 10 Market Street. The museum is open June through Labor Day, Tuesday through Saturday, 11 until 4. For our off-season museum schedule, call 338-9229. And to view today's show again, visit our website, www.belfastmuseum.org, and click on the video button. Thank you for joining us.